I'm here today with Karen González. Karen is a speaker, writer, public theologian, and immigrant advocate who herself immigrated from Guatemala as a child. Karen's a former public school teacher who attended Fuller Theological Seminary, where she studied theology and missiology. For the last 15 years, she's been a nonprofit professional currently working for an organization that serves asylum seekers. She wrote a book about her own immigration story and the many immigrants found in the Bible. That book is called The God Who Sees: Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. Her new book is titled Beyond Welcome: Centering Immigrants in Our Christian Response to Immigration. And it releases next week, actually Tuesday of the week that this is going to be posted, from Brazos Press. The book seeks to elevate the discourse in the church beyond hospitality to immigrants. Karen's a sought-after speaker who has written about and presented on a variety of faith-related topics, including spiritual formation, Latinx identity, race and culture, women in the church, the Enneagram, and immigration. She also has bylines in Sojourners, The Christian Century, Christianity Today, The Baltimore Sun, and other publications. She's the co-host of the Latina-focused podcast Cafe with Comrades. Karen lives in the heart of Baltimore, Maryland, where she enjoys cooking Guatemalan food, traveling, watching baseball, studying the Mayan language Cachiquel, and writing while her tabby cat, Oscar, naps beside her. I should also say that Karen is an alum from one of our Writing for Your Life conferences, and it's always wonderful to have an alum who's releasing a new book. So Karen, congratulations, and thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. And it's great to be here with you. It's great to feel like you've contributed. You were a part of all of this work that I've been able to do because it was at your conference that I really learned how to write a book proposal and how to pitch it around. So
Uh,
thank you.
no, well, it's the least I could do. I mean, like I said earlier, it's just my pleasure whenever this happens, and I'm so glad that you've done so well. You're your second book now since those days, so it's just fantastic to see. So I should mention also, Karen's website is karen-gonzalez.com. So Karen-Gonzalez.com. So maybe, Karen, what else would you like people to know about you than what I touched on briefly there in the intro?
I think you touched on everything that is, critical to this conversation. Yeah, I love to muse about theology and I love to watch baseball.
So before we get into the new book, why don't you tell folks about the first book?
Sure. So my first book is called The God Who Sees: Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. And I wrote that book really at the beginning of the Trump administration. And my belief at the time, and I still think this is true to a certain extent, is that people just didn't have information about the fact that the Bible speaks to immigration. I'm not a fan of saying the Bible is clear because I feel like that's very interpretive usually. But the Bible has a lot to say about immigration and about how we should engage immigrants in our midst. And I wanted people to see that. I wanted people to see that there were immigrants in the Bible. So the way that I structured the book is that every other chapter is about an immigrant in the Bible, including Jesus and his parents who fled to Egypt because Herod was persecuting and wanted to murder him. And so the other chapters in the book, there's 5 of those, are about my own faith, and they're structured around the sacraments of the church. So baptism and confirmation, anointing the sick, all the sacraments in the Catholic Church. And I use that framing because so much of my story of migration is reflected in my story of faith, of coming to faith. And so I wanted people to see those connections as well. And I tell the whole story about my family's migration, why we migrated, what our life was like in Guatemala before trouble started with the Civil War and afterward, and then all the way to the present. And so, yeah, so in that book, I really do a lot of advocacy. I also share a lot of data about immigration, a lot of information that people might not know. And I weave it into my story and the story of the immigrants in the Bible. People aren't used to thinking of, for example, Joseph in Genesis as a foreign person in Egypt, but that's in fact what it was.
Sure.
Or the fact that, Hagar was brought from
Yeah.
Egypt, into Canaan. Ruth left her own Moab country and came to Judah. And so all these people are immigrants, even though we're not used to thinking about them in that way.
Hmm. Very, very true. Well, it was a great book, and I'm really glad that it was so successful. And I'm also really glad you're following up with a new one. As I said, the title is Beyond Welcome, Centering Immigrants and Our Christian Response to Immigration. So what motivated you to write the second book?
So I was very motivated to write this book by the fact that I really wanted to elevate the discourse in the church. So for a lot of people, they already care about immigrants. They already believe in welcome, in hospitality, which I think is the very beginning of the conversation, but it's not the end. Really, we should start with hospitality and welcome. And then we should move into kinship. And then we should move into solidarity and then into advocacy together. But really, in the church, we talk about welcome if we talk about it at all. And then that's where the conversation ends. And to me, that's like kind of like planting roots in the driveway. You don't do that, right? You come all the way into the house and into the back garden.
That's a very good analogy.
So,
I've never heard that one before. Planting roots in the driveway. That's great.
yeah. And so in this book, I wanted to elevate the discourse and I wanted to focus less on what people can do because people are always interested in how they can be activists or what practices they can engage in. And I'm not saying that's not important because it is important, but I wanted to focus on being because I'm aware that things change when we change. And so I wanted people to consider what they think about land, what they think about hospitality. What do they think about migration and movement in general? What words are we using to describe immigrants? What myths have we unconsciously absorbed and live out because they're in our culture, they're in the ether. And so these are things I wanted to challenge people to consider and really pray through. And, I engaged a prayer at the end of every chapter because I really wanted people to sit with these ideas. Some of them are uncomfortable, like reevaluating the way we think about land and borders. That's really challenging and difficult for a lot of people. And again, I'm not seeking for people to change overnight, but to really start changing some of these narratives that are, without our realizing it, they do harm, not just to immigrants, but to a lot of marginalized
Hmm.
communities.
Hmm. So who would you say the book is most intended for?
It's definitely intended for people who already welcome. So this is not a 101. This is your 102.
Mm.
It's for people, okay, I believe in welcome and that's a good thing. Okay, so here's what's next.
What do we
If
do
you
next?
already believe this.
Cool, cool. So let me read a couple of the blurbs about the book. Publishers Weekly says the book is a top-notch Christian look at immigration, human and full of heart. That's a really nice compliment, obviously coming from them. Is that the tone of the book that you were aiming for?
Yes, I really, one of the things I actually learned at the Writing for Your Life conference is what kind of communicator, what kind of writer I wanted to be. And I wanted to be a writer who was warm, who was gracious, hospitable in my own rhetoric. Because when you're inviting people into conversations that are difficult, it's really helpful to be someone who is receptive and open and warm and not just someone who has a sledgehammer, right? And is going to, clobber people over the head with ideas. And so that's what I wanted to do. And so I do a lot of storytelling because I wanted to invite people into my story. I wanted to be vulnerable and model some of the things that I'm talking about in the chapters. And so that was really my goal is to be, yeah, to have it be a heartful book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Matthew Sorens says the book is challenging, constructive, and helpful, which to me sounds pretty practical. Um,
Mhm.
is that what you were aiming for too?
I wanted it to be practical in the sense that I didn't want people to feel like, oh, these are just these lofty ideas and there's nothing for me to really do or think about. And so it is practical in the sense that it is extremely accessible. I am not a, PhD in, New Testament or something like that. I wanted people to know this is practical theology. It's a theology for our hands and feet.
Hmm. So I think in the book you talk about what are some well-intended but harmful practices toward immigration that sometimes churches do. What are some of those that you're helping to change?
Sure. So for one is hospitality. So many churches, which I think is a very good thing. I am not at all criticizing this. For example, will engage in assisting in refugee resettlement or providing, services or even another service for immigrants on their church grounds. And what I've seen is that even though that is a good thing, the hospitality only seems to move in one direction. It's always from the native citizen with rights to the immigrant person in need. And what I wanted to challenge people with and advocate for was a reciprocal hospitality. So one where the native citizen does extend hospitality, but then the immigrant person also extends hospitality. They also have something to give, something to offer. And the reason I challenge this is not just because it's some kind of lofty idea, but because when hospitality only moves in one direction, we tend to start thinking of people as having less in every way, not just materially, but in every way. And what happens when we have reciprocal hospitality is now we're engaging in mutuality. Both groups are made in the image of God. Both have something to offer one another. And it really diminishes the power dynamics, for example, and also the objectification, right? The charity mindset. And it's more about now these people are my kin, right? There's a shared humanity that we have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that was really,
no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that was one of the myths that I wanted to challenge.
Recently, I did another book interview with Patty Krawiec, who's an Indigenous American, and the title of her book is Becoming Kin, which, has got a lot of parallels to what you're suggesting.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's something, yeah. And I want you to know, I actually consulted a lot of Indigenous theologians and writers as I was looking at this because there is a way that they write about relating to one another and to the land that I believe is very biblical. And it's a really excellent model, not just for immigration, but for dealing with things like climate change.
Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, and the way that we relate to God's creation.
Well, it's like kind of as you were alluding to earlier, it's like, whoever won the war, whatever the war was, are the ones that write the book, as if the other people don't matter, right? And that's just so wrong in so many levels. And so I think as a result, our current American society has a lot to learn from people who have been marginalized in all kinds of different ways, over the centuries. And so I like the way that you're bringing, one aspect of that to light. So, your new book is just coming out, but the last one's been out for a couple of years. Have you gotten much pushback about, the book or the talks that you've given about immigration, or how does that stand in your mind these days?
Yeah, generally people have been very gracious, even in their disagreement. And generally, people who disagree are people who, for example, their lives have been imperiled by a changing world and economy, by globalization. And I understand that when something puts your livelihood in danger, it's natural to want to look for, well, where's the blame? Where has this come from? What has been done to me, right? Who is responsible? And I understand that, but I also believe and know actually that the blame does not fall on immigrants. The world has changed, and there have been things, for example, like the North American Free Trade Agreement that have moved a lot of industries overseas. So that means those jobs disappeared in the US. Things like mining are no longer productive in the way that they used to be. And there's a lot of technology also that has, taken away jobs. And so there's that sector that really disagrees, and I think wrongly put the blame on immigrants for that, because that's clearly not what immigrants are about or what they're doing. And there's another sector, I think, of people who really believe strongly a lot of the narratives that you hear, for example, out of Fox News or coming from President Trump. And so, they say that when you're looking at your audience, there's 20% of people who are already on your side. And there's 20% who are rabidly against what you're saying. And there's about 60% in the middle who love God and who want to be faithful Christians, but don't know what to think about this issue. And so that's really who I was writing for. And that's who I was really trying to target. And so I wasn't, there are people who believe strongly, I'm going to go after and try to convince people, for example, who are very rabidly anti-immigration. I was going for that group in the middle, people trying to live as faithfully as they can and don't know what to think about immigration, don't know what the Bible says about it, and don't understand what the facts are versus what plays out on the media, for example. And so I've gotten a great response from that group of people. And yes, periodically I'll give a presentation or a lecture or a sermon somewhere, and you'll have people who push back, one or two people. But overwhelmingly, I think people are receptive, even when it's challenging. And I try to communicate it in a way that's warm. And I try to also engage the Bible in a way that's honest and clear, so that people don't think I just pulled this out of nowhere and now I'm putting God's stamp on it. And so I think that has also been helpful. So when I talk about, for example, the myth of the good immigrant, I talk about Rahab, this foreign Canaanite woman who became part of the Israelite community and who was a sex worker and who was kind of a trickster who lied. And we don't even know how genuine her conversion was, because it seems just very convenient. And I wanted people to see these narratives exist even in our scriptures.
So are you able now, since the pandemic is not as bad, at least as it used to be going on in-person book tours and signings and things?
In fact, tonight I'm headed to Nashville.
Oh, good.
doing a presentation for a conference of Presbyterians down there. And yes, and I'm headed to Portland at the end of the month, and then San Diego in early November. So yeah, now I think we're back in the swing of things. I did do one event this week at the university out in California that was over Zoom, but it seems like people are getting back to in person. And so it's nice to see, because then you can sign books for people, then you can, engage them in a conversation. So
good. That's good to hear. So I know you're in the midst of, a book launch, but do you have any future plans that you're able to talk about?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm looking at, so I'm looking at a couple of things. One is I am definitely thinking about more education, more theological education. So I'm looking at a PhD program in Christian ethics.
Wow.
With a focus on I want to focus on a theology of migration. So that's one thing that's on the horizon.
Good.
And yes, and I am looking at a third book that I want to write. Probably not on immigration. I'm thinking of writing a book that's more focused on singleness, just because as a single adult, I just see so much that's wrong in the way that the church approaches singleness, and we need healthier theologies of singleness to offer to people. And they need to come from those of us who are single, not people who've been married 50 years, so yeah.
Well, good for you. We'll look forward to that and get together again, I'm sure. So again, the title of the new book is Beyond Welcome, Centering Immigrants in Our Christian Response to Immigration. And you can learn more at Karen-Gonzalez.com. So Karen, again, congratulations on another great book and, all the work that you're doing. It's so good to see, and it's so, wonderful to learn from you.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's great to be here.